August 12th, 1944, 0730 hours. Rechlin Test Airfield, Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania. The morning mist hung low over the runway as Hauptmann Heinz Bär walked toward the most intimidating aircraft he had ever been assigned to fly. It sat alone on the dispersal area, massive and brutish, its broad wings and enormous fuselage dwarfing every German fighter on the field. The captured Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, bearing hastily applied Luftwaffe markings, looked less like a fighter and more like a flying fortress in its own right. Bär had 220 confirmed victories. He had flown the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 through nearly every combat theatre Germany had fought in. He had tangled with Spitfires over Britain, Yaks over Russia, and increasingly American fighters over the Reich itself, but nothing in his extensive combat experience had prepared him for what intelligence officers were now telling him about this machine. The P-47 weighed nearly 8 tons, fully loaded, more than twice the weight of his Bf 109. Its engine produced over 2,000 horsepower. And most troubling of all, German pilots who had engaged Thunderbolts reported something that defied tactical logic. The damn things would not go down. Bär had 40 minutes of fuel, 40 minutes to understand why Luftwaffe pilots were developing an almost superstitious dread of the massive American fighter bomber. 40 minutes to find a weakness, any weakness, that might give German interceptors a fighting chance. He did not know that what he was about to discover would fundamentally alter his understanding of what made an effective fighter aircraft, or that the brutal lessons learned in that short flight would haunt him through every subsequent encounter with American formations. By mid-1944, the air war over Europe had entered its most desperate phase for the Luftwaffe. American daylight bombing raids now penetrated deep into German airspace with near impunity, protected by swarms of long-range escorts that German fighters could neither outrun nor outlast. The P-51 Mustang received most of the attention in intelligence briefings, and rightfully so. Its combination of range, speed, and altitude performance had effectively ended Germany's ability to intercept bomber formations without suffering catastrophic losses. But it was the other American escort fighter that truly terrified experienced German pilots, the P-47 Thunderbolt. Where the Mustang was elegant and purpose-built for high-altitude escort, the Thunderbolt was something else entirely. A massive, brutish machine that seemed to violate every principle of fighter design the Luftwaffe had developed. It was too heavy, too large, too complex, and yet it was destroying German fighters at an alarming rate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The statistics were sobering. In the first 6 months of 1944, P-47 groups claimed over 1,000 German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, but the real story was in the loss rates. Thunderbolt pilots returned home at rates that seemed impossible given the intensity of combat over Germany. In May of 1944 alone, the 8th Air Force's P-47 groups flew over 15,000 sorties with a loss rate of less than 0.5%. German fighter units operating over their own territory were suffering loss rates exceeding 10% per mission. The discrepancy demanded explanation. Luftwaffe intelligence had recovered several P-47s in various states of damage, but finding one intact enough for proper evaluation had proven difficult. The Thunderbolt's reputation for surviving catastrophic damage meant that most downed examples were riddled with cannon fire, had burned, or had been deliberately destroyed by their pilots before capture. The aircraft waiting for Bär at Rechlin was a rare prize. P-47D Serial 42-26174 had been forced down near Kassel on July 28th, after sustaining flak damage during a ground attack mission. The pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert J. Morrison of the 358th Fighter Group, had nursed his damaged fighter as far as possible before executing a wheels-up landing in a harvested wheat field. Wehrmacht infantry reached the crash site within minutes, capturing Morrison, before he could destroy classified documents or sabotage his aircraft. Within days, the Thunderbolt had been transported to Rechlin, where Luftwaffe technicians spent 2 weeks repairing battle damage and returning it to flight status. Heinz Bär was the logical choice to evaluate it. At 32, he was one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced and respected pilots. His 220 victories placed him among the top-scoring aces in the service, but more importantly, he had demonstrated exceptional analytical ability in previous aircraft evaluations. Bär understood the difference between an aircraft's theoretical capabilities and its practical combat effectiveness. His reports were detailed, honest, and valued by commanders who needed tactical intelligence more than propaganda. The selection of Bär also reflected the evaluation's urgency. By August of 1944, the Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging experienced pilots at an unsustainable rate. Training programs that once produced thoroughly prepared aviators now rushed candidates through abbreviated courses, sending them into combat with minimal experience. The new pilots stood almost no chance against veteran American fighter pilots flying superior equipment. If German fighters were to have any hope of survival, experienced pilots like Bär needed to identify exploitable weaknesses in American designs and develop tactics that might level the playing field. Rechlin had served as the Luftwaffe's primary testing facility since the mid-1930s, located in rural Mecklenburg. The sprawling complex included multiple runways, extensive workshop facilities, and sophisticated instrumentation for performance testing. By 1944, Allied bombing had damaged portions of the base, but core testing capabilities remained intact. The facility had evaluated virtually every aircraft type that came into German hands, providing intelligence that shaped Luftwaffe tactical doctrine. The previous evening, Bär had reviewed the technical file assembled on the P-47D. The specifications were staggering. Empty weight, 4,900 kilograms. Maximum takeoff weight, 7,940 kilograms. By comparison, his familiar Bf-109 G6 weighed just 2,400 kilograms empty and 3,400 kilograms loaded. The Thunderbolt was nearly twice as heavy as Germany's primary interceptor. The engine was equally impressive and concerning. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp 18-cylinder radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff and maintained excellent power output at high altitude through a sophisticated turbo-supercharger system. German radial engines, like the BMW 801, struggled to match such output, and the complex turbo-supercharger technology had proven beyond German industrial capacity to mass-produce reliably. Armament was overwhelming. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, with a total ammunition capacity of 3,400 rounds. The firepower concentration was devastating. German fighters typically carried 1 or 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. The P-47's 8 heavy machine guns could deliver a weight of fire that would shred most German aircraft in seconds, but it was the operational details that most concerned Bär. Maximum speed at altitude, 428 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 43,000 feet. Combat radius with drop tanks, 475 miles, extendable to over 800 miles with proper fuel management. These specifications meant the Thunderbolt could escort bombers deep into German territory, fight at altitudes where most German fighters struggled to operate, and still return safely to English bases. More troubling were the pilot accounts. American P-47 pilots seemed to operate with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They would dive into German formations, absorb hits that would have destroyed any Luftwaffe fighter, and simply keep flying. Intelligence reports documented Thunderbolts returning to base with dozens of cannon shell hits, damaged engines, missing control surfaces, yet still under control. One documented case described a P-47 that returned to England with over 200 machine gun and cannon strikes, a missing cylinder from its engine, and 3 feet of its right wing shot away. The pilot had landed safely, and the aircraft was repaired and returned to service within a week. Such survivability fundamentally altered combat mathematics. German pilots knew that even if they achieved a solid hit on a Thunderbolt, the target might continue fighting or, at minimum, escape back to friendly territory. Conversely, a single burst from a P-47's 850 calibers could tear a Bf-109 apart. The psychological effect was corrosive. German pilots began avoiding engagement with Thunderbolts when possible, seeking softer targets or breaking off combat when the Americans dove to engage. Bär understood that his test flight needed to answer specific questions. How did the Thunderbolt's massive weight affect its handling? Could its size and bulk be exploited in turning combat? What were its true performance characteristics at various altitudes? Most critically, what vulnerabilities might German pilots exploit to achieve kills without sustaining catastrophic damage themselves? At 0700 hours, he began his external inspection. The P-47's dimensions were genuinely shocking up close. The fuselage was broad and deep, housing the massive radial engine, the turbo-supercharger system, and fuel tanks that dwarfed anything in German fighters. The cockpit sat high, providing excellent visibility, but also presenting a large profile that seemed to invite attack. The wings were thick and sturdy, with their substantial area explaining how the aircraft could fly at all given its weight. Each wing housed 4 50-caliber machine guns, with ammunition feeds running from storage areas inboard. The landing gear was robust, clearly engineered to handle the stress of the aircraft's weight during carrier-style landings on rough forward airstrips. The tail surfaces were equally substantial. The vertical stabilizer and rudder were massive, necessary to maintain directional control given the engine's enormous torque. Every aspect of the design communicated strength and durability. This was not a nimble dogfighter. It was a flying tank designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting. At 0720 hours, Bär climbed the wing walkway and settled into the cockpit. The interior was surprisingly spacious compared to German fighters. American designers had prioritized pilot comfort and workspace. The seat was well padded. The instrument panel, while crowded with gauges, was logically organized. Controls fell readily to hand. Everything spoke of an industrial philosophy that valued pilot effectiveness over minimal weight savings. The complexity was immediately apparent. The throttle quadrant included not just engine throttle but propeller pitch control, mixture control, and turbo-supercharger regulation. The fuel system was Byzantine, with multiple tanks that required careful management. Radio equipment was sophisticated, offering capabilities German pilots could only dream of. The gun sight was advanced, with adjustable ranging that simplified long-range shooting. Bär spent 15 minutes familiarizing himself with controls, committing critical items to memory. The checklist was extensive, far longer than anything German fighters required, but he recognized the thoroughness as another indication of American operational philosophy. Complexity was acceptable if it enhanced capability. German designs emphasized simplicity because maintenance infrastructure and pilot training could not support elaborate systems. At 0735, he was ready. Ground crew cleared the area. Bär engaged the starter. The massive R-2800 coughed twice, then caught with a deep, thunderous roar that dwarfed any sound German radial engines produced. The power was palpable even at idle. He checked engine instruments, oil pressure nominal, temperatures rising normally, all systems indicating green. He advanced the throttle slightly, testing response. The Thunderbolt shook but held position against its brakes. The engine note deepened to a bass rumble that he could feel through the airframe. This was power on a scale German engines simply did not provide. He began his taxi, immediately noting the excellent forward visibility compared to German fighters. The high seating position allowed him to see the runway clearly, eliminating the weaving taxi pattern necessary in Bf-109s. At the runway threshold, he completed final checks. Flaps set to takeoff position, elevator trim neutral, propeller full forward, mixture rich, turbo-supercharger to automatic. He glanced at his kneeboard, where he had written key performance benchmarks. His Bf-109G6 could reach 20,000 feet in 6.5 minutes and had a maximum speed of 386 miles per hour at 23,000 feet. Those were the numbers he needed to compare against. 0741 hours. He pushed the throttle forward and released brakes. The acceleration was nothing like a German fighter. The Thunderbolt surged forward with ponderous authority, building speed more slowly than his nimble 109, but with inexorable power. The tail came up at 60 miles per hour. At 95 miles per hour, he eased back on the stick. The massive fighter lifted off smoothly, settling into a steady climb that felt almost effortless despite the aircraft's weight. Gear retraction was slow but positive. He raised flaps in stages, noting how the aircraft's trim remained stable throughout the configuration changes. German fighters required constant trim adjustment. The Thunderbolt seemed to fly itself. He established his initial climb at 170 miles per hour indicated, consulting notes from the technical file on optimal climb speeds. The rate of climb indicator showed 2,800 feet per minute at sea level. Respectable for the aircraft's weight, but nothing exceptional. His 109 could manage 3,500 feet per minute under the same conditions. In a climbing contest from low altitude, German fighters maintained an advantage. But Bär knew the real test would come at altitude, where the turbo-supercharger's advantages would manifest. As he climbed through 5,000 feet, he began exploring control responses. The ailerons were heavy but effective, requiring firm pressure but producing predictable results. The elevator was similarly weighted, demanding more input than German fighters, but responding smoothly. Rudder was the real surprise. The massive tail surfaces required substantial pressure to coordinate turns, but provided exceptional directional stability. The Thunderbolt tracked straight with almost no pilot input, a characteristic that would reduce fatigue during long escort missions. At 10,000 feet, 5 minutes into the flight, he leveled off for initial speed tests. He pushed the throttle to maximum continuous power and adjusted the turbo supercharger for optimal manifold pressure. The Thunderbolt accelerated smoothly, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The airspeed indicator settled at 418 miles per hour, indicated at 10,000 feet. He checked his notes. His 109 G6 achieved approximately 375 miles per hour at the same altitude. At low to medium altitude, the Thunderbolt was 40 to 50 miles per hour faster. The speed advantage was substantial enough to dictate engagement terms. If a P-47 pilot wanted to fight, German pilots could not easily refuse. If the American chose to disengage, German fighters could not catch him. But Bär knew this was not the critical performance envelope. Combat over Germany occurred at 20 to 30,000 feet where heavy bombers operated. He needed altitude performance data. He resumed his climb, advancing power and adjusting the turbo supercharger as altitude increased. The turbo supercharger system was revelation. As he climbed through 15,000 feet, engine power remained strong instead of degrading like naturally aspirated German engines. At 18,000 feet, his 109 would be struggling, losing power rapidly as air density decreased. The Thunderbolt maintained full throttle pressure through the turbo supercharger, sustaining performance the German pilots could not match. At 20,000 feet, 12 minutes after takeoff, he leveled off again. This was the critical test altitude. He stabilized at maximum continuous power and watched the airspeed indicator climb. 380 miles per hour, 400, 420. The needle settled at 428 miles per hour. At combat altitude, the Thunderbolt was faster than any operational German fighter. His 109 topped out at 386 miles per hour at 23,000 feet, over 40 miles per hour slower. The implications were stark. At the altitudes where interception combat occurred, P-47s could outrun German fighters. They could choose when to engage and when to escape. German tactical doctrine emphasized hit-and-run attacks, diving from altitude to achieve speed advantage, making a firing pass, then using momentum to climb away. Against Thunderbolts, this tactic lost effectiveness because the American fighter could match or exceed German dive speeds and had superior power to maintain energy in subsequent maneuvers. Bär climbed to 25,000 feet to test high-altitude handling. At this altitude, most German fighters became sluggish and unresponsive. His 109 would be approaching its operational ceiling, controls mushy, climb rate minimal. The Thunderbolt continued flying with authority. Controls remained responsive. Engine power stayed strong. The turbo-supercharger maintained manifold pressure that gave the massive radial performance German engines could only achieve at medium altitudes. He executed a series of turns at 25,000 feet, gradually increasing bank angle and G-load. The Thunderbolt turned surprisingly well, given its weight. The turn radius was wider than his 109, but not dramatically so. More importantly, the aircraft maintained energy through turns better than he expected. The massive engine's power compensated for the weight penalty, allowing the P-47 to sustain turning combat without bleeding speed excessively. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This was troubling. German tactical wisdom held that heavy fighters could not turn with lighter opponents. The solution to engaging aircraft like the P-47 should be to force turning combat where German fighters' lower wing loading and better power-to-weight ratio would dominate. But the Thunderbolt's sheer power partially negated those advantages. A P-47 pilot who accepted turning combat would not be at as severe a disadvantage as German pilots assumed. 22 minutes into the flight, Bär climbed to 28,000 feet to test the characteristic that most concerned Luftwaffe intelligence: dive performance. Multiple pilot reports described Thunderbolts diving away from attacks at speeds German fighters could not match. Intelligence estimated P-47s could exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive, possibly approaching 600. If accurate, this meant that any Thunderbolt pilot who chose to disengage by diving could escape regardless of tactical situation. At 28,000 feet, Bär rolled inverted and pulled into a steep dive. The Thunderbolt accelerated rapidly, 450 miles per hour, 480, 500. The airspeed indicator continued climbing, 520, 540. The control loads increased dramatically as speed built, but the aircraft remained manageable. At 560 miles per hour, indicated, approaching the aircraft's design limits, he pulled back firmly on the stick. The G-forces were substantial, but the Thunderbolt responded smoothly. The massive airframe groaned under the loads, but held together. He bottomed out at 15,000 feet, having descended 13,000 feet in less than 30 seconds. He immediately transitioned to a maximum power climb to evaluate energy retention. The results were eye-opening. The Thunderbolt maintained high speed through the pullout and converted that energy into climb with impressive efficiency. The massive engine roared at full power, the turbo-supercharger screaming as it forced air into the cylinders. Climb rate exceeded 3,500 feet per minute. He reached 25,000 feet in just under 3 minutes of climbing. This was the characteristic that made the P-47 so dangerous. It could dive to attack or escape at speeds German fighters could not match. Then it could climb back to altitude using energy retention and brute power that German aircraft lacked. A Thunderbolt pilot could engage on his terms, make a single devastating pass with those 8 50 caliber guns, then use speed and power to escape before German pilots could react effectively. Bär understood now why so many Luftwaffe pilots were dying in encounters with P-47s. The Thunderbolt dictated engagement parameters. If the American pilot chose to fight, German pilots found themselves engaged with an aircraft that was faster, could sustain combat at higher altitudes, and could escape at will by diving. If the German pilot tried to disengage, the P-47 could run him down with superior speed or dive performance. 30 minutes into the flight, fuel was approaching the halfway point. He needed to test the one characteristic that might offer German pilots hope: turning performance at sustained high G-loads. Light fighters should theoretically outturn heavy ones through extended combat. If German pilots could force sustained turning engagements, perhaps they could exploit the Thunderbolt's weight penalty. He established a series of maximum performance level turns at 20,000 feet, simulating combat maneuvering. The Thunderbolt responded well initially. The turn rate was acceptable, the controls remained responsive, and the engine provided enough power to maintain speed through the first several turns. But as the maneuvering continued, a weakness began emerging. The high wing loading and heavy weight meant the P-47 bled energy more rapidly in sustained turns than lighter German fighters. After 3 full deflection turns, the airspeed had decreased from 350 miles per hour to 280. Energy management became critical. A Thunderbolt pilot who accepted prolonged turning combat would eventually find himself at a disadvantage as speed decreased and his aircraft's weight worked against him. This was potentially exploitable. If German pilots could force sustained horizontal maneuvering, they might eventually achieve advantage. But Bär immediately recognized the problem with this tactic. It required the P-47 pilot to accept the engagement and remain committed to turning combat. Any competent American pilot would recognize the energy loss and simply disengage, using superior straight-line speed to separate, then resetting the engagement on favorable terms. German pilots could win sustained turning fights against Thunderbolts only if the American pilot made tactical errors. Against experienced P-47 pilots who understood their aircraft's strengths and limitations, the tactic would fail. The Thunderbolt's pilot could simply refuse disadvantageous combat. 35 minutes into the flight, Bär turned back toward Rechlin, simultaneously testing the final critical characteristic, gun platform stability. He maneuvered the P-47 through various combat simulations, rolling into firing positions and evaluating how the aircraft tracked targets. The results were impressive. The heavy airframe absorbed turbulence and control inputs with minimal disturbance. The gun sight remained stable even during aggressive maneuvering. He simulated deflection shooting scenarios, leading imaginary targets through high-angle off attacks. The Thunderbolt's controls were precise enough for accurate gunnery despite their heavy feel. Combined with the 8 50 caliber machine guns hitting power, the P-47 was a devastating gun platform. A 1-second burst delivered approximately 130 rounds. At typical combat ranges of 200 to 400 yards, that volume of fire could destroy most aircraft. German fighters carried heavier individual weapons, particularly the 20mm MG 150-120 cannon, but fired far fewer rounds per second. The 109 G6's typical armament of one 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns delivered approximately 1,600 grams of projectile weight per second. The P-47's 850s delivered approximately 3,000 grams per second. The American fighter's volume of fire compensated for its lighter individual projectiles. 40 minutes into the flight, fuel remaining demanded return to base. Bär descended toward Rechlin, processing what he had learned. The Thunderbolt was unlike any fighter he had encountered. It violated conventional German design philosophy, yet was devastatingly effective. Where German fighters emphasized lightweight, tight turning capability, and heavy cannon armament, the Thunderbolt prioritized speed, altitude performance, range, survivability, and volume of fire. He entered the landing pattern, reducing speed and configuring the aircraft for landing. The P-47 slowed obediently, controls remaining effective even at approach speeds. Flaps deployment was straightforward. The landing gear extended with satisfying mechanical solidity. He aligned with the runway, managing the aircraft's energy carefully. The Thunderbolt's weight made it less forgiving of pilot errors during landing. The touchdown was firm but controlled. The robust landing gear absorbed the impact without complaint. He applied brakes carefully, noting their effectiveness. The P-47 rolled to a stop after consuming most of the runway's length. He taxied to the dispersal area where ground crew and intelligence officers waited anxiously. Engine shutdown took longer than German fighters required. The complex systems demanded methodical checklist execution, even for simple operations. But eventually, the massive R-2800 fell silent, its cylinders ticking as they cooled. Bär sat motionless for several moments, organizing his thoughts. What he needed to communicate in his report would not be welcomed by Luftwaffe command, but honesty demanded it. The truth was stark. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented capabilities German fighters could not match and tactical advantages German pilots could not overcome through skill alone. He climbed down from the cockpit to brief intelligence officers and begin the detailed written report that would circulate through Luftwaffe command channels. The conclusions would be precise, technical, and devastating, and they would change nothing. Because by August of 1944, understanding the enemy's advantages and countering them were entirely different problems, and Germany no longer had the resources to solve the latter. The intelligence debriefing began within minutes of Bär climbing down from the cockpit. 3 officers from the Luftwaffe High Command's Technical Evaluation Section had traveled specifically to Rechlin to hear his assessment. They crowded into a sparse briefing room, notebooks open, faces betraying the anxiety that permeated all Luftwaffe operations by late summer 1944. They needed good news. They needed exploitable weaknesses. They needed hope that German fighters could counter the American juggernaut. Bär provided none of those things. His verbal briefing was methodical and thorough, covering each performance parameter he had tested. Maximum speed at altitude exceeds German fighters by 40 to 50 miles per hour. Dive performance, exceptional, capable of speeds approaching 600 miles per hour with controllability maintained. Energy retention, superior to German fighters in vertical maneuvers. Altitude capability. Operational effectiveness, maintained to at least 30,000 feet, well above effective German fighter operations. The intelligence officers pressed him on potential weaknesses. Surely the aircraft's weight created vulnerabilities. Bär acknowledged that sustained turning combat degraded the Thunderbolt's energy state more rapidly than lighter German fighters, but he emphasized the critical caveat. The P-47 pilot could simply refuse sustained turning engagement, using superior speed to disengage and reset combat on favorable terms. The weight disadvantage only mattered if the American pilot made tactical errors. What about the complexity? Systems. Could maintenance difficulties ground P-47 units and reduce operational availability? Bär had examined the aircraft's construction closely. While complex, everything was engineered for reliability and ease of maintenance. American industrial philosophy emphasized robust components that could be quickly replaced rather than repaired. The modular approach meant damaged aircraft could be returned to service rapidly with minimal specialized labor. One officer asked the question that mattered most. Based on your evaluation, what tactics should German pilots employ when engaging Thunderbolts? Bär's response was blunt. Avoid engagement if possible. If combat is unavoidable, attack only from superior altitude with significant energy advantage. Make a single high-speed pass, then disengage immediately by diving away. Do not attempt sustained combat. Do not pursue if the P-47 dives to escape. Above all, do not allow Thunderbolts to achieve positional advantage, as their speed and power make it nearly impossible to escape once they commit to attack. The recommendation essentially advised defensive tactics bordering on retreat. For a Luftwaffe that had built its reputation on aggressive offensive action, the assessment was profoundly demoralizing. But Bär's combat record and analytical reputation made his conclusions impossible to dismiss. The officers thanked him tersely and departed to compile their report for higher command. Over the following 3 days, Bär wrote his detailed technical assessment. The document ran 18 pages, including performance charts comparing the P-47D to German fighters across multiple parameters. Every metric told the same story. The Thunderbolt equaled or exceeded German fighter capabilities in areas that mattered for combat over Germany. The report's most significant section addressed the fundamental design philosophy difference between American and German fighters. German doctrine emphasized maneuverability and cannon armament, assuming combat would occur in close-range turning engagements where superior handling could compensate for performance deficits. This philosophy had worked well early in the war against opponents with comparable or inferior performance. But the P-47 represented a different approach. American designers prioritized speed, altitude performance, dive capability, and survivability. The resulting aircraft avoided close combat where German fighters' advantages might matter, instead employing hit-and-run tactics that exploited American strengths while minimizing exposure to German cannon fire. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns could inflict devastating damage in brief firing passes. Then, the aircraft's speed and dive performance allowed escape before German pilots could respond. Bär's conclusion was stark. The P-47D represents a fundamental challenge to current Luftwaffe tactical doctrine. German fighters cannot force engagement on favorable terms. We cannot escape. When combat becomes disadvantageous, we cannot match the Thunderbolt's performance at combat altitudes. Pilot skill and aggressive tactics cannot overcome these systemic disadvantages. Without aircraft of comparable performance, German fighter units will continue suffering unsustainable losses. The report circulated through Luftwaffe command with predictable results. Some officers acknowledged the assessment's accuracy, but noted that Germany lacked the industrial capacity and resources to develop comparable aircraft. The Me-262 jet fighter showed promise, but production delays, engine reliability problems and fuel shortages meant operational deployment remained months away. Other officers rejected Bär's conclusions entirely, insisting that superior German pilot training and tactical innovation could overcome equipment disadvantages. But frontline fighter pilots who read the report recognized its truth immediately. They were living Bär's conclusions every day. Unofficial copies spread through fighter units across the Reich, passed hand to hand by pilots desperate for any information that might improve their survival odds. The report's tactical recommendations became informal doctrine for experienced pilots. Avoid Thunderbolts when possible, engage only from overwhelming advantage, disengage immediately if combat turns unfavorable. The captured P-47D at Rechlin flew several additional evaluation missions with different test pilots, confirming Bär's findings. Each pilot emerged with the same sobering assessment. The Thunderbolt was a superb combat aircraft that German fighters could not match. By October 1944, the captured P-47 had been transferred to Circus Rosarius, the Luftwaffe's enemy aircraft demonstration unit, where it joined the captured Mustang and other Allied aircraft used to train German pilots in recognition and tactics. But the training value was limited. Teaching German pilots to recognize Thunderbolts was easy. Teaching them how to defeat Thunderbolts was impossible because no effective tactics existed. The demonstrations primarily served to prepare pilots psychologically for the performance disadvantages they would face, hopefully preventing the fatal tactical errors that occurred when pilots underestimated their opponents. Heinz Bär returned to operational flying after his Rechlin evaluation, assigned to command positions where his experience and tactical knowledge could benefit younger pilots. But his 40 minutes in the captured P-47 had fundamentally altered his approach to combat against American formations. He no longer sought engagement with Thunderbolts or Mustangs unless circumstances provided overwhelming advantage. He taught his pilots the same doctrine of selective engagement and rapid disengagement. Combat records from late 1944 demonstrate the Luftwaffe's declining effectiveness against American fighter escorts. In September 1944, German fighters claimed approximately 280 American aircraft destroyed, but lost over 1,000 fighters themselves, a loss ratio approaching 4-1. By November, the ratio had worsened to nearly 5-1. Experienced pilots like Bär survived through careful tactical discipline, but replacement pilots with minimal training died within their first few missions. The P-47 Thunderbolt's combat record validated everything Bär had discovered during his evaluation. By war's end, P-47s had destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft, more than any other American fighter type. The loss ratio was remarkable. For every Thunderbolt lost to enemy action, German fighters lost more than 4 aircraft. In the ground attack role, where the P-47's ruggedness and firepower proved devastating, the aircraft destroyed thousands of vehicles, trains and installations while absorbing damage that would have downed any German fighter. The survivability that Bär had noted in the technical specifications translated into extraordinary pilot survival rates. P-47 pilots had the highest return-to-base rate of any fighter type in Europe. The aircraft's radial engine, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection, and robust airframe meant pilots walked away from damage that would have been fatal in lighter aircraft. This survivability advantage compounded the Luftwaffe's problems. Not only were American fighters superior in performance, but their pilots survived to accumulate experience that German pilots rarely lived long enough to gain. Post-war analysis revealed the full extent of Germany's industrial disadvantage. Republic Aviation produced over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts during the war. Production peaked at over 1,000 aircraft monthly in late 1944. German production of all fighter types combined never exceeded 1,000 monthly and declined steadily through 1945 as Allied bombing destroyed factories and severed supply chains. Even if German fighters had achieved performance parity, which they did not, the numerical disparity was insurmountable. The P-47's complexity, which German observers initially viewed as a weakness, actually reflected American industrial sophistication. The turbo-supercharger system that German engineers could not reliably mass-produce was manufactured by the thousands in American factories with consistent quality. The sophisticated radio equipment, hydraulic systems, and instrumentation that required extensive German hand assembly were stamped out on American production lines. Industrial capacity determined combat outcomes as much as tactical skill. Heinz Bär survived the war, one of the few Luftwaffe aces with over 200 victories to see peace. He flew jets in the war's final months, experiencing another technological leap that came too late to affect outcomes. Post-war, he reflected candidly on his experiences evaluating captured Allied aircraft. In interviews, decades later, he remained consistent in his assessment of the Thunderbolt. "The P-47 was the most impressive fighter I evaluated during the war," he stated in a 1968 interview. "Not the fastest, that was the Mustang. Not the most maneuverable, that was the Spitfire. But the most complete combat aircraft. It could do everything well. Speed, altitude, firepower, range, survivability. There was no single area where German fighters had clear advantage, and many areas where we were decisively inferior." He continued, "After flying the P-47, I understood why American pilots seemed so confident, almost reckless in combat. They knew their aircraft could absorb damage, outrun pursuers, outclimb interceptors. That confidence translated into aggressive tactics that German pilots could not counter. We were flying defensively in our own airspace, trying to survive, while they were offensive even as escort fighters. The psychological advantage was as significant as the performance advantage." When asked if superior German pilot skill could have overcome the equipment disadvantage, Bär was dismissive. "Skill matters when opponents are roughly equal in equipment. When one side has aircraft that are 40 miles per hour faster, climb better, fight effectively at higher altitude, and can escape at will, skill cannot bridge that gap. We had excellent pilots, among the best in the world, but they died because we sent them against superior equipment in insufficient numbers with inadequate fuel and support. Individual excellence cannot overcome systemic disadvantage." Modern aviation historians recognize the P-47 Thunderbolt as one of World War II's most successful fighter designs. Its combination of performance, survivability, and versatility made it effective across multiple roles, from high-altitude escort to ground attack. The aircraft served with air forces worldwide for decades after the war, remaining operational in some militaries into the 1960s. The lessons from Bär's 40-minute evaluation extended beyond tactical aviation. The Thunderbolt exemplified industrial warfare principles that determined the war's outcome. Complex systems could be mass-produced with consistent quality if industrial infrastructure and resources were adequate. Pilot survivability and aircraft robustness multiplied force effectiveness by preserving experienced personnel. Operational flexibility mattered as much as specialized capability. The aircraft that could perform multiple roles well had greater strategic value than specialized designs that excelled in narrow circumstances. For the Luftwaffe, the P-47 represented an insurmountable challenge that appeared over German skies in ever-increasing numbers through 1944 and 45. German pilots learned to recognize the Thunderbolt's distinctive profile, its wide wings and deep fuselage, with a mixture of respect and dread. Engaging one required caution, favorable positioning, and immediate disengagement. Engaging multiple P-47s was suicidal unless German pilots possessed overwhelming numerical and positional advantage, circumstances that became increasingly rare as the war progressed. The captured P-47D that Bär evaluated at Rechlin met an ignominious end in April 1945. As Soviet forces advanced toward the test facility, remaining German personnel attempted to destroy equipment and documents to prevent capture. The Thunderbolt, along with other captured Allied aircraft, was burned where it sat on the dispersal area. Soviet troops, reaching Rechlin days later, found only charred remains of the aircraft that had provided German intelligence with such valuable and demoralizing information. Heinz Bär's 40 minutes in that captured Thunderbolt had revealed truths that Luftwaffe leadership could acknowledge but not address. Germany was losing the technological war. American industrial capacity was producing weapons systems that German factories could not match in quality or quantity. Pilot training advantages had shifted decisively to the Allies. Fuel shortages grounded German fighters, while American formations operated with near impunity. One test flight, 40 minutes of evaluation, 18 pages of honest technical analysis. The captured P-47 had taught a Luftwaffe ace that his 220 victories, earned through skill and courage, meant little against opponents flying superior aircraft in overwhelming numbers. That sometimes individual excellence was simply not enough. Those wars were won in factories as much as in cockpits. That, by August 1944, Germany's defeat was not a question of if, but when. Bär never fought a Thunderbolt again with the aggressive tactics that had made him an ace. After his evaluation, he engaged P-47s only when tactical circumstances offered clear advantage and disengaged the moment combat turned unfavorable. He survived the war not through superior skill alone, but through accepting the harsh reality that his captured test flight had revealed. The enemy had won the technological race, and no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome that fundamental disadvantage. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew on in American service for decades, its rugged reliability and devastating effectiveness securing its place in aviation history. Heinz Bär's 40-minute evaluation flight and the report it generated became one small footnote in that history. A moment when an experienced German ace climbed into his enemy's machine and discovered not just an aircraft, but the industrial reality that had already decided the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.